Good morning, everyone. My name is Marjorie Kaplan, and I'm the Associate Director of the Rutgers Climate Institute. And along with my colleague, Jean Herb of the Rutgers Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, we co-facilitate the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance's second in a series of 3 events around the theme of New Jersey leading the way on climate change solutions. Our first event was on September 15th. Those of you who attended saw NJDEP Commissioner Catherine McCabe and and New Jersey Board of Public Utilities President Joseph Federico provide state climate and energy policy updates. A recording of that is available on our website. A quick logistics note, other than today's presenters, you're all muted. So to communicate with us, please type your questions into the chat box. To find the chat box, you look at the bottom of your screen. You should see a little bubble that says chat. And if you click on that, you can send us questions and comments. And please send your notes to all panelists, as that ensures all of us working behind the scenes today will see your questions. We welcome your thoughts and your questions. I also want to let you know that we'll be recording today's webinar and will be available on our website, and I'll type that in a second. I'd now like to invite Martha Maxwell Doyle of the Barnegat Bay Partnership and co-chair of the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance to turn on her camera and her microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. On behalf of my co-chair, Gary Sondermeyer, who represents Bayshore Recycling on the Alliance, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's virtual dialogue. This fall, the Alliance is kicking off its 10th year. We are a statewide network of over 50 diverse organizations committed to advancing evidence-based, nonpartisan climate change strategies at the state and local levels in New Jersey. We work within and across sectors and have produced more than 50 reports on topics ranging from what people, places, and assets are most vulnerable to climate change and why, to the identification of policy options and best practices for New Jersey. For instance, the Alliance commissioned the first Science and Technical Advisory Panel on sea level rise for New Jersey, resulting in the 2016 report that was updated in 2019. The report has been embraced by state government for planning and regulatory purposes. We have also developed straightforward communication materials and convenings like today's event and spearheaded the development of decision support tools for New Jersey. In addition to Rutgers University, we would like to thank the sponsors of today's events, including the Energy Foundation, PSE&G, Bayshore Recycling, NJM Insurance Group, the New Jersey Clean Energy Program, Mazer Consulting, and the New Jersey Conservation Foundation. We would also like to thank Eagleton Institute of Politics Center on the American Governor for co-sponsoring this event today. The Alliance owes a debt of gratitude to Governor Kean and Florio, who have lent their support to the Alliance since its formation in 2011. We are also pleased to have them and Governor Whitman with us today. It is now my pleasure to invite John Weingarten, Associate Director of Eagleton Institute, to turn on his camera and microphone so that he may moderate today's dialogue. John?
Thank you, Martha. I believe my microphone is on, my camera is on. The reality of climate change has raised an ever-growing list of complex problems and issues that touch upon every sector of society, often with profound impacts. The Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling has worked with the Alliance to ask New Jersey residents about their views of climate change, and we have found that 2/3 of those surveyed are either very concerned or at least somewhat concerned about the effects of climate change on their lives, their family members, or the people around them. For today's session, presented by the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance, we are fortunate to have the 3 former governors who led the state from 1982 through 2000. They are uniquely able to speak to this morning's theme of opportunities for leadership, learning from the past to inform the future. It is my privilege to join Martha in welcoming the Honorable Thomas H. Kean, the Honorable James J. Florio, and the Honorable Christine Todd Whitman, the 48th, 49th, and 50th governors of New Jersey, and to begin by asking all 3 of them, all 3 of you, to turn on your cameras and your microphones and start the program by having each of the governors first providing some reflections on leadership and past lessons that can help inform effective means for addressing the climate crisis. And I'll begin by asking Governor Kean to start us off.
Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I'm on. Okay, good. So thank you all very much. Thank you particularly to members of the Alliance. You've been there since very early times. You've worked well. You've made a difference already. You're going to make a much greater difference in the future. And to say what a pleasure it is, frankly, to be on with my friends, Governor Florio and Governor Whitman. Basically, their whole lives has been spent working in one way or another to improve New Jersey's environment. So I just want to say to them also, thank you, and what a pleasure it is to be with you. Let me start in a little bit of an unusual way. I'd like to read a piece of an executive order. Whereas a scientific consensus exists that emissions of certain gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbon, or after CFCs anyway, and halons are causing significant changes in the composition of the Earth's atmosphere. And whereas a scientific consensus also exists that these emissions are likely to cause significant changes in the Earth's climate, including overall warming, increased drought, and increase in the intensity of hurricanes and other major storms, as well as increased incidence of harmful ultraviolet radiation. And whereas these climate changes are predicted to result in increases in sea levels, geographic shifts in habitats of many plants and animals, and the extinction of a potentially large number of species. And then it goes on, there are 20 other whereases, and then a whole things of things we should be doing. I read you that for one simple reason. I wrote that over 30 years ago. That was an executive order for the state of New Jersey, written in the 80s. And I want to point out that we have known, I talk about a scientific consensus then, we have known, and there's been a scientific consensus for well over 30 years. And we've done some things, but as you know, not nearly enough. And we're working together now. The consensus of the scientists, maybe it was 90% when I wrote that executive order, now maybe 99%, but the consensus has always been there. And the question is, what are we going to do now? And the fact we've got so much less time than we had 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we had a lot of time to think about this and act. Now the scientists tell us the time is very, very limited. We don't know how much time we have, 30 years, 50 years, 70 years, we're not sure. But at some point, this is going to get so bad, the scientists tell us, that it may be irreversible. And that we have to act at every level, starting with the federal government and the world governments, frankly, and down to the state governments, local governments, and down to each of us as individuals who've got to take our part in reducing these terrible gases and this terrible problem. So that's where we are now. And the thing is, we know what to do. The scientists tell us what we have to do. The question is whether we've got the will to do it, whether we got the political will, whether we got the personal will, whether we got the national will to really take this in hand. If we follow the recommendations and the guidance of the people in the Alliance in New Jersey, we're going to be doing our part. So I want to I want to thank you. Thank all members of the Alliance, thank everybody who's out there. We got to redouble our efforts. The time is shrinking. The need is great. The actions we have to take are tremendous. But I think in New Jersey, we can do it. New Jersey can overcome problems, and we always have in the past. This is the biggest problem we have. But I think if we all care about it and work together, I think New Jersey should be able to lead the nation, because being the most crowded state and one of the smallest with the long coastline, we have maybe the greatest problems. So anyway, thank you very much again to the Alliance.
Thank you, Governor Kean, for that urgent and cautiously optimistic, perhaps, start to the program. Governor Florio, would you like to share your thoughts with us? Governor Florio?
Yes, I'm on.
There you are.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with the two governors. We're friends, and we worked together over the years with some of these issues. I want to say that these are interesting times there are times that are dramatically changing very rapidly. And at such times, making policy is very important, but very difficult in some respects. What we're talking about is policy changes that are made to be put into effect quickly. And the fact is that change is outpacing our ability to formulate policy in a way that is relevant to the problems that we're facing. And in the area of climate change, it is particularly difficult because climate change is very complex, as was stated by the governor. It's multifaceted and deals with everything that you have to deal with. You're dealing with water policy changes, you're dealing with public health, you're dealing with energy. All aspects of our life is impacted by the changes that we have to make in dealing with climate change. In some respects, leadership is required to be able to have people out there dealing with these matters in a way that allows us to get people engaged. That the general public has to be engaged and informed. Engaged because there's a need to have people really involved in the whole definition of participatory democracy, which our system is all about. Likewise, informed because the choices are becoming more complex, and government is about choices. Government is about making decisions in terms of the directions that we want to go in. With regard to climate change, there's a need for us to be able to get involved so as to bring citizens into the process. And that's something that's very important for us to do. There are lots of examples of where people get engaged and we get things done. If the citizens are not engaged, things don't get done. We have what we have at this point in our whole life. I guess progress is able to be made. New Jersey has a good reputation for being environmentally very sensitive. I can remember the days when we go to meetings and people would ask if we want to have environmental sensitivity or economic progress. Now we know that's naive. That's not a good formulation. You're not going to have economic growth if you don't have environmental sensitivity. New Jersey is particularly interested in that area because we understand we have water-intensive industries, agriculture, food processing, energy. Those things have to be dealt with only if we have environmental sensitivity. So it's very important for us to be able to do that. And yet at the same time, we understand that these things are not easy. Taking on the status quo is not for the faint-hearted. And the status quo is always there, even when you have objectively bad policies. There's always defenders of status quo. Generally, people who are making money. Think tobacco, think guns, think coal. Those are the things that entail people becoming engaged and informed, not allowing us to go forward. So I think we're going to get some interaction today, maybe point out some suggestions of things to do. But again, it will only be done if we have people involved in the process actively. So I commend everyone who's responsible for this program because it's a part of being disciples for change that's beneficial.
Thank you, Governor Florio. Governor Whitman, would you like to provide us your thoughts?
Sure. Again, thank you to the Alliance, and it's a pleasure to be on with my fellow former governors. And, you know, as Governor Kean said, it was more than 30 years ago, probably, Tom, that you signed that executive order, and the science has only gotten stronger about the threat of climate change since then. We had a study done, what was it, maybe 10 years ago, probably now, by the Regional Plan Association showing the impact of sea level rise on the shores of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, and what that meant for, what that implied for planning, for zoning, for how do we recover from things. You know, I think this is going to be the first election that I can remember anyway, where an environmental issue is going to be part of the discussion because climate change is at the forefront right now. Whether you're talking about the fires from the droughts in the West, or the flooding and the storms and the hurricanes that they've had in the Gulf Coast this year. And we're about to get another, I think it's number 24 named storm coming up from the Atlantic. This has been an extraordinary year that has brought these issues to the fore, which makes it more imperative that you have leadership at the top that accepts this as an important issue. It's an important issue, not just to the United States. I mean, as of July 8th, it was of this year, long before you had the fires in California, before the worst of the hurricane damage that we've seen on the Gulf Coast, you had 10 major weather climate related events, each of which cost us $1 billion in recovery. Now, you just add on what's happened since then, and you understand it's an extraordinary, and that's irrespective of the loss of life, the loss of ways of life, people losing their businesses, their homes, total dislocation. We're seeing a crisis on our doorstep, but it's also an international crisis that has significant concerns for us. It is something that is an existential threat, because as developing countries are destabilized because of climate change, we see that's where groups like Al-Qaeda go to recruit. Organized crime thrives in those cities where people are having to move into the cities because they can't maintain a nomadic lifestyle anymore because of droughts. So this is hurting us all around the world, much less our military response to sea level rise. Our naval bases along the coast have already had enormous problems and are trying to think of how do they relocate, where do they put the ships. This is something that we can no longer ignore. But I believe, and what we're seeing is that the action is taking place as it so often does at the state level. That's where you see things happening in the cities, because governors and mayors and local officials have to respond to their constituents in a very direct way. And when their constituents are being impacted by this, they are taking action. And that's why I'm glad to see that we are back in Reggie, that it's the state of New Jersey, that we are taking these steps. It's important, but that's the kind of leadership we have to have. And you can't have it, as Governor Florio said, it's difficult because you'll always have entrenched interests that are going to push back against you. But if the public stands up and says, I'm sorry, we're concerned about this issue, we want it addressed and we want to know how you're going to address it. If we ask our elected representatives or those seeking our vote those questions, that brings it to the fore and really forces them to take a more active role in helping to craft the kinds of responses we need. We're not going to stop sea level rise. It's going to happen. We've gone too far now for that, but we can slow it, and we need to harden ourselves in our response to it so we can understand how we live in a future with the kind of climate change that we are seeing today and going to see even more of as we go forward.
Thank you, Governor Whitman. I'd like to open this up to a discussion amongst you, and to start off, all three of you dealt with environmental issues that were certainly important and contentious, but there wasn't and there were entrenched interests, as Governor Whitman just said, but there wasn't certainly to the same extent, distrust of science, of information. There wasn't the same level of distrust of institutions. And I wonder what your thoughts are about how to move forward in that climate, or how to change that attitude so that particularly government, but other institutions can gain sufficient public trust to be able to move forward with or gain support for aggressive policies.
I think it's going to be, I'll chime in here. I think it's going to be extremely difficult until we have the leadership at the top that stops denigrating science. We have seen over the last 3.5 years a war on science, frankly. It's been dismissed. It's been demonized in ways. And until that changes, it's going to be very difficult. It is up to the leaders at all levels to remind people of the importance of science, the critical need to follow science with things like the pandemic. Got to follow science on this. I think we're learning, even some of those who have opposed taking some of the steps that have been recommended are now realizing, you know what, we better take this seriously. We better do what's being asked of us. But I think it's going to be hard to bring science back in the way that we need to bring it back without it's tough. Let me put it another way. It's tough when you're fighting against a message from the bully pulpit that says we really don't have to pay much attention to it.
But I think we have to all formulate new ways of communicating with people. With things becoming bigger and bigger, it becomes more difficult for people not to feel remote from decision making. You've got to determine how you actually get the town meeting mentality to get people have to be informed about things. As was stated by Governor Whitman, science and factual information has to get out there to give people the opportunity to make their own decisions on the basis of the facts that are there. If they don't hear about these things, they don't really become engaged until they think it's something that affects them. I mean, a good example is the whole gun violence issue. People are now becoming engaged in ways they were not in the past because they become engaged because they see people being killed, their children being shot in schools. Therefore, they're now fully involved, want to find out what happens when you have assault weapons available. And if you don't take action, you'll be impacted directly. When you're impacted directly, you take action to do things to correct the problems. You can't fix a problem if you don't understand the problem. And if you don't know there is a problem, you're not going to be able to deal with it either.
I'm a bit optimistic in this area, strangely enough. I've been working with a number of organizations, I'm aware of others now, who understand the importance of making science understandable to the public and the public more acceptance of science, more accepting of science. And the scientists themselves, in many cases, have decided they got to come out of their labs and talk to the public about these things and join organizations that are helping to make the message clearer to the public. And it's already starting to make some progress. For instance, if we get a vaccine, which we all hope for sooner rather than later, what happens if people don't accept the scientists' word that the vaccine is a good vaccine? It's going to help you, not hurt you. Because if we have a vaccine and people don't take the vaccine, we're all going to be at risk again. Mm-hmm. So people have got to accept the word of the scientists that this vaccine is working and is going to be helpful to you. And there are so many other examples. But foundations, other organizations are now working together to find out how we break this impasse, how we convince people that, yes, science is good, science is working for the public good, and science's word is something that's got to be accepted and understood and followed if we're going to make progress, not only against this virus, but against climate change and against so many other problems that are going to affect us in the future if they're not affecting us already.
I agree. I'd like to add to what Governor Kean said. There's an organization that I've been doing a little work with talking about how do you get scientists to speak in real language that the average person can understand, because they're so involved with what they're doing and they presume a level of knowledge that just is not necessarily common, nor should it be, nor should we expect it to be. And one of the things the Aspen Institute now is instituted working on a curriculum, or how do we get climate change education into the K through 12 schools? How do we do this in an articulate way? How do we do this that is an affordable way for school districts to include it? Because if you start getting children aware, and if you start getting children involved, as we all know, they can push their parents to do things that they might not otherwise have done. So there are good things that are happening, but it's still tough in this particular atmosphere.
Let me give you an example of a contemporary issue that requires education that's particularly relevant to climate change. The whole offshore wind power generation initiative is something that's very good for climate change. It provides for clean energy. The Department of Interior in Washington is in the process, should be in the process, of issuing permits to go forward for the development of offshore wind. They've been dragging their feet recently. And the fact of the matter is that people are concerned about the fact of that slowness of the process, because there's more interest, apparently, Department of Interior, in offshore drilling for oil, issuing permits for leasing, issuing permits for testing. The fact is that's being put on hold because it's unpopular and we have an election coming up. The fact is, if in fact there is the ability to let that be held in suspension, the Secretary of Interior has talked about a pause in the process. The concern, of course, is the pause will exist till after the election. Depending upon the outcome of the election, it may very well be that there's an acceleration of offshore drilling, particularly off the coast of New Jersey and off the coast of the east coast of the country. There's no real direct competition because offshore drilling takes place further out than offshore wind generation. But the competition for access in by cables and power lines is a source of difficulty, a zero-sum situation, potentially. We have to get people engaged in understanding the difference between offshore wind generation, which is clean energy, offshore oil drilling, which has multiple problems and is not clean energy. It's a good example of where citizen education impacting upon the political process, the policy process, is very important for people to undertake.
We're all sort of at Rutgers as we speak, and I want to ask you your thoughts about how academia and government can work effectively together on issues of science in general and climate change particularly, based on your experience. And I know there are times when it has seemed that the government, academia has been supportive and helpful in moving policy along, and other times when that hasn't worked out so well. Any of your reflections on that are?
Well, I'll start off. I think academia can be enormously helpful. In my administration, they were enormously helpful. We got, as you may remember, a group of the best scientists from the State University and from Princeton together on a group and said, look, what are the most important things this state needs from its state university for the future? And that commission came up with a number of recommendations, which we then funded and implemented, which changed the direction in some ways of the state university as to what they were going to do with their research in the future. So I think, look, there are tremendous assets in academia, a lot of brains in a lot of areas. And unfortunately, more at Princeton than at Rutgers, but in general, it's been separated from state policy. It's been a silo over here and government over here. Mm-hmm. These times are too perilous. We have to work together. And academia has a tremendous amount to contribute. But state government, frankly, has got to ask them to do it.
Let me throw out one more topic and then we'll open this up to other people. Do you see this remaining, or ways for it not to be the partisan issue it has become at the national level, at least? That certainly the tradition in New Jersey, going back to when any of the three of you were governor, was that the environmental protection was maybe a geographic issue, but not a partisan issue. Knowing someone's party was not a predictor of what they were going to feel about strengthening environmental regulation or other laws. And I'm not sure at the state level the extent to which that's still true, but wonder whether there are ways to make that be less of an obstacle.
I think Mother Nature is doing that for us. Mother Nature could care less about geopolitical boundaries, and where you live, it doesn't care whether you're a registered Republican or Democrat. And people are starting to understand that. It's an issue that transcends politics. Unfortunately, everything today has been squished into this political prism. Everything's looked at through the partisan political prism rather than the policy prism. But we're getting to the point with things like climate change where that just doesn't work anymore. Because we had, what, 3 days, 3 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago, where the sun, there was a haze between us and the sun, which was the smoke from the California fires. People understood that. You have to, and the other thing that we found, for instance, what we found at EPA when I was there, is the time when people really watch the news is during the weather. they care about that because that affects whether they can have a picnic or not, or whether they can play golf, whatever. So that's the time to try to educate them. Taking these non-traditional routes, we did that with watershed management. We got into an agreement for a pilot program on watershed-based management with meteorologists, that when they were predicting heavy storms, that they would also say, and oh, by the way, this is not a good time to fertilize your lawn or to heavily pesticide your crops or anything, because it's all going to run into, you may not live on a river, but it's going to run into this storm drain, which drains into a creek or a river and ends up in the ocean. We have to look for those kinds of ways to do it, but I think we're seeing more and more of that already. And certainly all the meteorologists that I saw were very clear when we had that period of time where the smoke from the California fires were affecting us, to mention that and say that's what it was. And that, I think, is starting to penetrate.
I would agree with Governor Whitman. I mean, reality is being highlighted by real leaders in this area to point out what is actually happening. For example, the Regional Planning Association, Mrs. Whitman mentioned earlier, came up with a study not too long ago that said that within 15 years, Teterboro Airport will be underwater. That's a reality. That has implications for all kinds of aspects of our life. So leadership can point to those things. Ultimately, the inevitability of some of the consequences of not doing anything correct in this area become very obvious.
Yeah, I think we got to remove this as a partisan issue. This should be nonpartisan. And that can be done, I think, frankly, by voters. I mean, look at the people who are running, frankly, and make sure that people who support climate change solutions. If they're not, there's another choice on the ballot. But the people can act here, and I think it's time to do it and ask candidates what they believe, and if they're not supporters of climate change, find somebody else.
Okay. I'd like to, Gene Herb, who's been involved in putting this together and a longtime colleague, first at DEP and now at Rutgers, has been monitoring the chat box, if it's a box. And Gene, do you want to
Sure.
the points from there?
Sure. Good morning, John. Thank you so much. And good morning, governors. We have a lot of questions that I'm sure we won't be able to get to all of them. And we also have a lot of thanks to the governors for pointing out a number of issues, including the connections between addressing climate change and economic benefits, the importance of citizenry and voting related to climate change, and then also the importance of advancing policy while also simultaneously undertaking education efforts. So there's a couple thank yous like that. I'll go back and forth with a couple questions that I think are relevant to all of the governors' comments, a little bit on the resilience and preparedness front, a little bit on the emissions front. So one question is, how can New Jersey better position itself to be able to have the work that it's doing with regard to climate change be seen as national models?
The perennial challenge of New Jersey, the valley of humility between two mountains of conceit in Philadelphia and New York. I mean, as Benjamin Franklin said, I mean, we can get it out. It takes validation, it's not up to the governor solely to say this is what we're doing and to highlight it. Everybody who's working on these issues needs to be heard. They need to go to the conferences and talk about what we're doing. And as Governor Florio mentioned, you have an internet now that is extraordinary and a way of communicating. There's a lot we can do to highlight the initiatives that are being taken in this state and to be seen as a leader. But it's been a problem for all of us, is getting the recognition for New Jersey that it deserves.
Governors Kean or Florio, any thoughts on that?
I just second what Governor Whitman said.
Thank you.
I would suggest that we should highlight some of the areas that we are excelling in. For example, water technology. New Jersey is doing a lot of good things in this area, bringing to the attention new types of technology. There's a wonderful book that people should read called Let There Be Water by a fellow Seth Siegel, that talks about Israeli water technology policies, which have converted the situation in Israel to the point of being a water-deprived nation, to the point where Israel is now exporting water to Jordan because of the technology that's been developed there. New Jersey is doing a lot of this sort of thing, and we have good water presence. I would like to see New Jersey at some point be the Silicon Valley of water technology. I think that's an area that we can really focus on for economic benefits as well as for the environmental benefits of climate change as well. So focusing on areas that we really excel at is a good thing.
Thank you. Here's a question that I'm sure was something that you all dealt with during your terms with regard to the role of local officials, in particular municipalities. How can we convince local officials, particularly at the municipal level, to govern with climate change and future climate projections, including sea level rise in mind, and in order to be able to be more protective as we're involved in local planning for our communities?
I'll start. I mean, first of all, I think you've got to educate them. They care most, because that's what they're elected for, about their individual town, the city, or whatever it is. And that city or town is going to be impacted by climate change. Nobody in New Jersey is very far from the shore to begin with. Even if you have a community that has no relation to the shore, your people do. The middle class does most of their investments probably in a summer home at the shore. So these issues are going to affect the people in every municipality. And I think we've got to educate these mayors, councilmen, what have you, how it affects them, how it affects their constituents, and then work with them to see what they can do at the local level. And citizens can really help here. You go to town meetings, if you go to town halls or whatever, ask the questions, make the statements, point out, educate people. Because I think once they're educated, I think they'll be better on climate change.
I would only add that I think we need to give them the tools too, and show them what kind of tools are available. The state government has more resources than these municipalities, and that's where those resources should be directed, to share them with the local governments, share them on what are best practices, what they can do. One of the hardest things I know is to get people to understand the cumulative impact of individual behavior. And it's really almost the same with the municipalities. It really does matter what your neighboring municipality does, how it uses water, how it doesn't, how it plans. And so we need to put all those resources plus things like the Alliance and the Regional Plan Association to spend time with mayors to help educate them. As Governor Kean says, they need education, but they need some help with the tools of the kinds of things that they can actually proactively do to address the issues.
I think it's also a natural inclination to find more local interests in environmental matters. I see towns across the state. The city of Camden has a very active citizens movement dealing with environmental problems, and legitimately so. I mean, for example, Superfund. There are more Superfund sites in New Jersey than any other state. I think something like 115. We only have 21 counties. So that means there's roughly an average of 5 of these sites per county. I mean, nobody lives very far from these sites, which by definition are imminent and substantial hazards to people's health and the environment. So this is not a remote problem. This is a problem that's close in. As a result of that, people at the local level can be persuaded that it's in their interests to do things about remediating some of these sites.
Thank you. So kind of going from the local to the national, the next question, well, the person who asked the question is assuming that there'll be a new president after November 3rd, but I think the question is relevant regardless of who the president is. So the question is, in order to be able to guide our country, citizens, politicians, communities, and states towards being in the same direction and in undertaking valid choices to combat climate change, should the president of our country convene a president's council on climate change mitigation? So I think in general the question really sort of stretches to, in your experience, whether when is it appropriate to be convening blue ribbon commissions commissions and high-level councils to be able to advise government on challenging issues like climate?
I would argue you don't need another commission. There have been enough commissions on this. There have been enough studies on this. What you need is a president who says, this is an issue of importance. This is one on which we're going to focus. And I am telling all the departments and agencies that have an involvement on this. And you have the Office of the Environment in the White House. And that job of that person is to coordinate the various departments and agencies to address issues. If they're told climate change is the issue, then you bring together your cabinet members, you bring together your sub-cabinet members, you let them put together working groups. You don't need some outside blue ribbon panel. I don't believe. You take the resources that you have, but it does take a commitment from the top to say, this is one of my priorities. Joe Biden has indicated that that's going to be at the top of his agenda. And then President Trump at this point clearly still does not embrace the need to do this. He's been dismembering our ability to address the issues. But that's what needs to happen in my mind. You use the resources you have there. You have really knowledgeable scientists, the ones that are left. Unfortunately, so many have left and been denigrated, but you can bring them back. You can bring back some of those. But you need cabinet officials who are on the president's schedule, who understand that this is what he wants done and will help him get it done. It's going to be a him right now, him get it done at this stage, and to do it, but within the administration. You don't need to bring in outside. You don't need to wait any longer. Come on, we know what the issues are and we know what's facing us. So start putting all the resources of the Fed that we have at the federal government level already, focus like a laser on this, and then we can get something done.
I think you need creative leadership at the top to be able to point out to people the relevance to their lives of dealing with climate change. The whole idea of jobs. We're going to have more jobs out of clean energy than we will out of fossil fuels in the future. So that making that case to people, and however you do it, whether commissions or just speaking engagements, there's a need to make it clear to people that our self-interest is in the public interest, and to say compatible, and that dealing with climate change takes care of many of the other problems that we know that we're facing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I might say the leadership, you're absolutely right, is important. If you look at the state of the state that a governor gives, or the annual state of the nation the president gives, what items are they talking about? What's the headline in the speech? And if the headline is climate change, if that dominates the speech, whether it's a governor or a president, that's going to be the agenda of the administration. Right. And that's going to come right down to the local level. So I think they're absolutely right. Leadership is vital on this.
We have a couple questions that are, I'm going to kind of mash together, I guess, and they relate to trust and communication and collaboration with scientists and fake news, I guess, and false language. So in general, I think where the questions are heading is, how can leaders best form collaborative and trustful relationships with the science community, recognizing that science is always evolving, and as a result of that, sometimes it leads the public to not trust it. So how can leaders work with the science community to better arm citizens and leaders to be able to talk about sound strategies to address challenges like climate change, and to be able to help the public be able to respond to inaccurate statements that they may hear in their own daily lives? There's a lot in that question, so you can each pick out which pieces of it you'd like to focus on.
Well, I talk about the debate that we had just recently as a good example of how we do not disseminate information for people to make decisions. I'm all for going back to the League of Women Voters conducting these debates as opposed to the media outlets. So we have information being given out so that people can make their own determinations. Figuring out how to communicate better is something should be focused on.
Thank you.
I co-chair a committee on civil discourse, and we're putting out a number of suggestions of how to start working at local levels to help promote this. And we have a number of state legislators who are part of it. We educate and they will go to new legislatures when they're being sworn in, or right after they're sworn in, to work with them on methodology. And sometimes it's simple things. Up in Maine, one of the things they did is decided that this partisanship has gotten so bad, and that you have this aisle and people hate each other across the aisle. So what the Senate president did, and because it's a unicameral actually up there, she
Uh-oh.
Did everyone get frozen or just Governor Whitman?
I'm here, John.
Okay.
Am I frozen?
You're not
No,
frozen.
I think it's just Governor Whitman. We'll give her a few seconds to see what happens.
I think I know the end of the sentence she was just saying, which was the leader of the legislature reshuffled the seating so that people there was not a Republican side and a Democratic side.
Right. They had to sit next to one another and talk to one another. And they didn't like it at first, but they had to admit it did make a difference. So there's some little things that can be done that can make an enormous difference.
You know, when I did the 9/11 Commission, it was a very partisan group to start with. We had to make it bipartisan. We started with the same place Governor Whitman just mentioned. I said no Republican at a public meeting or a private meeting could sit next to another Republican. Democrats had to sit next to Republicans. Then I said, if you get asked to appear on television, you got to take somebody from the other party with you. They didn't like that at all. Was that right? Former congressman. They did it finally. And in public, and anyway, we had private meetings in the evening. We were just social to get to know each other. We went to each other's homes and gradually became past the partisan divisions so that we recognized we were human beings. All of us were trying to do the right thing. So we got to get back to that somehow. We got to get back to it. Not only, we almost got to start with ourselves. Problems in this country now of talking to each other about public policy are greater than I've ever seen before. You got to realize that even if people disagree with you totally, they may be good people, and you should be talking to them, and you shouldn't put a barrier to them as a friend or what have you. You know, you just got to talk and get to know each other. And if we do this as human beings, individual to individual, maybe that'll start to spread to the public policy. So we get out of this terrible partisanship and terrible hatred, really, which is going on now in this country, which if it's allowed to continue, will destroy the country and destroy the democracy.
Right. We have the Problem Solvers Caucus in the Congress, which is a good start. For a couple of years, it was only in the House because the House members were a little more willing to agree to one of the requirements of a problem solver. First of all, it has to be paired. You can't come in as a Republican without a Democrat. It has to be even numbered. And they agreed that if 75% of them come to consensus on an issue, they'll all back it. And that was easier to get done, get agreement on the House side. But now we have a Senate caucus as well. And the Problem Solvers Caucus, that bipartisan bill that was introduced, I guess, a week ago and then shot down by both sides because it was a compromise, was actually the Problem Solvers bill, and they got a lot of attention for that. But I agree with the Governor Kean. That's where you've got to start. And I also agree we have to start with each other.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if you could, and again, I'm trying to bring together themes from various questions. If you could reflect on, during your times as governors, each of you had some very difficult issues and decisions to make, and your decisions on various issues were not necessarily embraced by everybody, right? So if you could think about addressing your answer to this question to the younger generation, to our students at Rutgers University and to the other universities and colleges and community colleges throughout New Jersey, in terms of thinking about courage in leadership, because we're certainly seeing a lot of our attention on climate change here in the United States and in New Jersey coming from that next generation. So if you could reflect a little bit on how to make difficult decisions on complex issues, knowing that it's not going to make you the most popular person in the state of New Jersey. Any advice you would offer that next generation as they're growing into their leadership roles?
I'd just say one thing to start off with. I think you got to decide in your own mind, your own conscience, what's right and what's wrong. And once you clear in your own mind on an issue, then I think you go ahead with it, even if it's not the most popular thing in the world. I remember one issue I had when South Africa, which had apartheid, we were the first state to divest all our investments from anybody who did business with South Africa. Nobody else had done it. The business community was totally against it. The White House called and said, please don't do it. That's foreign policy. And I thought about it and thought, we should all be condemning apartheid. It's wrong. And everything we can do in this country to put pressure on it so it disappears, we ought to be doing. So I made the decision and signed a bill to end any investment with any company or any individual who had anything to do with apartheid. It worked out very well. My advisor said it wasn't going to, because the whole business community is going to come at you. But it worked out very well because it was the right thing to do. And I think basically, in my experience, when you really decide you're going to do the right thing, in the end, even though it's difficult.
Thank you.
I think making the difference, thinking between short-term and long-term interests, pointing out to people that we have to think more about long-term versus short-term. Nobody likes raising taxes at all. Of course, nobody likes having a bridge collapse or a tunnel fall apart. So giving people the options of two alternative approaches forces people to think in ways that they might not think initially. So that perspective on things will help people come to better long-term decisions.
Thank you.
I think the other thing that you have to remember and understand is you do what you know or you feel does the greatest good for the greatest number, knowing that you can never please everyone. And it's not comfortable to be in that position. Certainly, I think each of us have been in it. Anybody who has had public office or really a major leadership position at any level faces that. And as Governor Kean said, when you feel what you know is right and you feel it strongly, you go with your gut. You have one person with whom you get up every morning and go to bed with every night for the rest of your life, and that's you. And you have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I am doing what I honestly feel is in the best interest of the greatest number of people, understanding that it is impossible to please everyone at once. You just can't. Even within families, you don't have that kind of consensus. So why would you expect it on the broader political field?
Thanks all of you. I have one more question. There's a lot more questions, and governors, we will share the content of the chat box with all of you because you have offers for a briefing from the State Department of Environmental Protection on its climate policies. You have some recommendations for strategies and organizations that are doing effective climate change communication. You have a lot of questions about future climate policy. So we will be sure to share that chat box with you. But I guess just sort of in terms of a last question, just wondering if you wanted to reflect on some of your experiences and also your involvement on this issue at this point, in the point in time that we are now. What a challenging time we live in. And if there's one piece of advice that you might give to Governor Murphy on this issue of climate change, whatever it is, philosophic, specific policy, if there's one thing that you would want to pass along to Governor Murphy, recognizing again all the context and the challenges of the times that he governs in. Any takers?
Well, I mean, somebody has to go first. I guess. Go ahead, Tom. You go ahead.
Look, Governor Murphy is governing in a time of COVID, which is beyond anything any of us ever had to deal with on our watch. And so it's different.
Yeah.
But my advice to him would be the environment, climate in particular, has got to stay at the top of the agenda. Even while you're going through COVID, even while you're going through budget crises, even when you're going through all this stuff, you got to put the environment and climate up top because it's about the future. It's because it's about our children and our grandchildren. It's about the fact whether our state and our shoreline is going to survive the way it is now. It's about so much that even though you're distracted with all these current problems, that you've really got to keep climate change and the environment up at top of the agenda. You've got to remind the people you serve consistently that it is.
Thank you. Governor Whitman, you were going to offer
No,
some
I mean,
thoughts.
really echo what Governor Kean said. I can't give advice to a sitting governor. They face different challenges than any of us faced. It's a different time. But I would agree that you still need to, you can't forget about climate change, because I would argue that, frankly, this pandemic that we're facing is climate change is involved. As the climate changes, as things warm, you change the ecosystem and you change pathogens. You have pathogens that are coming in contact with one another that never were. They morph. They get to animals that haven't had protections against them, and the animals are moving in closer to humans. We're having more contact. So there's all this contact that we're having, and it's all involved with climate change is part of it. And it can mean that we have more of this kind of a pandemic in our futures if we don't take these issues seriously.
Thank you. Governor Florio?
I think there's a need to appreciate the fact that there will be tough decisions that have to be made in connection with this. There are interests. The fossil fuel industry is unhappy in some respects because the trend across the country and the world is ultimately going to be clean energy is something that is both desirable and good for us. So to continue to be tough when you have to be, but be collegial as much as you can, that's an important approach to deal with this whole matter.
Thank you. Those are wise words for life. John, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Jean. I just want to thank the three governors, Governor Kean, Florio, and Whitman, for two sort of specific things. And one is for presiding over administrations that made it fun to be a bureaucrat in state government and set an atmosphere that I think encouraged smart, younger people to go in government and try to solve problems. And I think that's an important piece of moving forward. And secondly, for the extraordinary commitment to public policy and civil discourse all three of you have shown in the years since you were governor. And I think that's, the state is much richer for that. And I thank you for it. And I'll turn the program back over to Marjorie Kaplan, who will dream it up.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure to hear from all of you this morning. And on behalf of the Alliance, we really want to thank you, Governor Kean, Governor Florio, and Governor Whitman. And we also like to thank John and the Eagleton Institute of Politics Center for the American Governor for your support and help with today's event. And we also like to thank all of you who attended for sharing your thoughts and participating in this discussion. A recording of today's event will be available in the next day or so at njadapt.rutgers.edu. And without further ado, I'll just say this concludes today's event. Have a lovely weekend, and thank you.
Thank you.
Stay safe and healthy.